Brace yourself.
The last few years have been rough for Platinum Games. Even as a fan of their more successful titles like Bayonetta, Vanquish, and Nier Automata, I can clearly see that there have been some growing pains at the company recently. The middling reception to their licensed titles, the lackluster release of Star Fox Zero, the cancellation of Scalebound, it's been troubling to say the least. And I don't like admitting this, but for one reason or another, Platinum has proven to be as susceptible to mediocrity as any other game studio. There's still a lot to look forward to with games like Bayonetta 3 and Grand Blue Fantasy Project Relink on the way, but for the first time I can remember, I'm not looking at Platinum's future with unwavering confidence. So to contextualize my perspective, or even to just give myself some reassurance, I want to look at Platinum's past. I want to examine their earliest years, the time when their reputation was as fresh and full of potential as possible. So it's off to the 0 hour. Today's video looks at the first game released by Platinum Games. It's time to revisit Mad World. Platinum Games has had quite the history. Stemming from the dissolution of Clover Studios after a number of commercial failures under Capcom, the studio was built to preserve a creative mentality that since has defined some of the most daring projects ever to come out of the Japanese video game industry. It was formed as a dream team featuring prominent figures like Resident Evil's Shinji Mikami and Devil May Cry's Hideki Kamiya, and the drive that brought us triumphant titles like Beautiful Joe and Okami was ultimately meant to persevere beyond Capcom's limitations. But Platinum's first game was helmed by neither Mikami nor Kamiya. It was directed by Shigenori Nishikawa, designer for series like Dino Crisis and Resident Evil, who would eventually leave Platinum Games to work with Mikami at his studio Tango Gameworks and contribute to the divisive horror game The Evil Within. Mad World is Nishikawa's directorial opus, but it wasn't just his time to shine. It marked a rebirth of an all-star lineup of industry icons, brought together under a single banner. The team had a lot to prove, both to the public and to their former publisher Capcom. Mad World was their moment to stand and deliver.
Let the games begin.
We gotta get it up. Let's go, y'all. Let's go, y'all. Y'all ready to ride? Y'all ready to fly?
Mad World follows Jack, a muscular brawler who's roped into the program Death Watch, a gladiatorial survival game where the public must kill or be killed. Trapped in the island town of Berrigan City, Jack's goal is to conquer the various all-stars of the death game and steadily climb the leaderboards to number 1. Jack splits intel with Amala, a government spy, and Agent 13, who sponsors Jack's murderous actions to help him progress in the games. Now, I could continue detailing the game's story, but I honestly find it to be a pointless endeavor. Mad World's story is all over the place, introducing plot points and secondary characters without any intention of keeping itself together in a consistent fold. Mad World is best enjoyed when it drops the ideological pondering and stops taking itself seriously. And it shouldn't take itself seriously, because when it all comes down to it, Mad World is a cartoon. It's violent, with its shimmering red blood hues splashed atop a stylish black and white art direction. It's crass, with its vulgar commentary from Whose Line Is It Anyways Greg Proops, and his co-commentator Futurama and Adventure Time's John DiMaggio.
Yeah, I fought her in the Eastern Bloc Games and lost the match. 4 pints of plasma and was declared legally dead for a week. Awesome rock on her, though. Oh, true that. While you're blinded by her headlights, she'll sick a swarm of bastard bats on you to mess up your shit. Plus, the fuckers have fleas. Awesome rock on her, though. True that.
The death animations are grotesque, so intricately stylized to make the most artfully gruesome murder scenes in the biz. It can get a little stomach churning, but that's really the point. Despite its efforts to prove otherwise, Mad World isn't some philosophical look at humankind's perverse desire to find joy in suffering. It's a game, and interpreting it as anything but that is really missing the point. But Mad World's core design is something unusual, even for the Platinum Games veterans of 2009. Racking up combos in Devil May Cry or Beautiful Joe were widely praised directions in the past, but Mad World doesn't fit with either of these games. On the surface, it's about high scores and stylish moves, but Mad World's ethos is something alien to Platinum Games' pedigree. Character action game design might appear to be in its DNA, but what's really shocking is that it's a mutation of it. Something I noticed in my recent playthrough of Mad World is just how unlike a character action game it is. Prior to Platinum, Clover Studios delivered extravagant, stylish combat in games like Beautiful Joe and God Hand. And Platinum would later hone their trademark flow in games like Bayonetta and Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Mad World, on the other hand, feels more restrictive. There's a noticeable lack of fluidity to its movement, though I think that can partially be cited to Jack's character himself and how Platinum wanted him to play. Jack is no Dante, he's not Raiden, he's not Bayonetta. His muscular, almost stocky design fits a more reserved movement style, which could be considered the antithesis of Platinum's character action ethos. Jack himself is inherently grounded. There's really nothing he does that screams superhuman when it comes to physical abilities. He's an everyman, a psychopathic murdering everyman, but an everyman. Making his actions feel less extravagant was an interesting move for Platinum to make, especially in their first title under that banner. But despite Jack's persona, Mad World still wants the player to revel in its absurd, over-the-top style, and Deathwatch is pretty much the golden opportunity for them to go wild. In a universe where gory, violent, and indulgent murder is treated as entertainment, Mad World throws the player into a playground where this kind of blood sport is encouraged. It's a smorgasbord of environmental killing tools, and like any great character action game, keeping your techniques varied and diverse is the way to the top. Taking a single enemy and shoving a barrel over their head, then running a signpost through their skull and finishing them off by repeatedly slamming them into a spiked wall is just the basic recipe for points. It's literally introduced in the tutorial, in fact. Mad World wants the player to stack the violent acts high, and Platinum built each stage with this in mind. There are so many ways to turn an enemy into a corpse, from shoving them into a slot machine to tossing them into a lit fireplace. It's just insane. This all means that level design becomes the crux of Mad World's argument. It's all about environments that are brutal enough to be perverse entertainment, but also calculated enough so combos can easily be built by consecutive and varied kills. Any game that focuses on high scores and combos via its stages needs to address level design with this mindset, as random and incongruous level construction delivers neither a honed challenge nor a consistent flow for gameplay. Stacking your score sky high takes a surprising level of contemplation from the player, and Mad World definitely addresses this in an interesting way. Because of this mentality, the level becomes a mechanic. The challenge comes in navigating it, understanding the level's enemies' properties, and interacting with them throughout the level in a consistent way. High scores are not easy to get in Deathwatch, but digging into the level structure is huge combo potential. The act of intricately building upon levels instead of player movesets is a remarkably un-Platinum way to go about designing a game. Bayonetta's combat intricacies lied in varied skills and weapons, combined with different enemy types to keep the player on their toes. The same can be said of Metal Gear Rising's combat, and even Nier Automata's, but Mad World's depth is nearly entirely level-based. Sure, you get new weapons throughout the game, but your best chance for high scores demands understanding the environment's complexities, something far removed from many other projects from the studio.
Yeah, don't ever get it confused. I'm in the game to win and never to lose. I breathe in the win and then move the whole globe without ever losing. Ain't cool.
Interestingly enough, the Bloodbath challenges are the most removed from this mentality. They're usually self-contained scenarios, minigames that appear when you start them, then leave the level when you're finished. When it comes to delivering unique mechanics, the Bloodbath challenges are the epicenter. Targeting a golf club swing to smack an enemy's head through floating rings has no real effect on the level itself. In many cases, these are removed from the level's context entirely, standing alone as ways to score points, but not via the level structure themselves. The way these break up level consistency is notable, but their goofiness still manages to stay within Mad World's target tone. Similarly, the motorcycle stages are separate from the main levels, but their simplistic gameplay and rote structures don't do too much to show off Platinum's take on environmental design within Mad World. While I do like the Bloodbath challenges and certain parts of the motorbike stages, they stick out like sore thumbs. Aside from a few themed moments like the subway train challenge, these scenarios act as ways for Platinum to experiment with mechanics without worrying about how they can be logically placed within a level. These moments are Platinum cheating a bit on their design, but I'd be lying if I said they were bad inclusions to Mad World. But Mad World does serve one other tradition that has become a common occurrence in many Japanese games like it: memorable boss fights. Looking back at Platinum's other work, along with their past projects as Clover Studios, boss fights are routinely an effortless success for the studio. It's all about charismatic enemies with unique abilities and personalities, all for the sake of challenge and memorability. Mad World definitely delivers some of the most bizarre boss fights seen on the Wii, but very much like the Bloodbath challenges, these are separated from the levels themselves. There isn't much opportunity to dig into the stages because they're often just standard arenas. To make matters worse, boss fights show how limited the core mechanics of Mad World are. Most of the time, you're just dodging and swinging your chainsaw when the enemy has an opening, while participating in power struggles, which are quick-time events with hilariously gruesome fight choreography. Yes, character action games are notable for having these kinds of boss fight duels, but unlike a game like Bayonetta where the depth comes from the character and their movesets, Mad World focuses on environmental depth in the main levels. When you take that away, you don't have too much else to impress the player. While I don't think the boss fights are inherently bad, they are weaker entries that don't reach the pantheon of memorable boss encounters that the best action games routinely attain.
Let's go. Yeah, he that beat, spit that fire, kill that beat, pull that smoke and breathe that heat. DJ's gon' put that on repeat.
So with all that in mind, Mad World needed something to spice up its combat outside of the main levels. And when it comes right down to it, that's where the motion controls come in. The Wii's legacy of motion controls has become a bit of a running joke for the system, even in its more popular and well-received titles. But Mad World controls actually quite well. The moves are very responsive, even in QuickTime events, and like the better uses of motion controls on the system, these are implemented in a way that doesn't hamper the game's physical flow. In my opinion, if Wii controls were visually evaluated, they'd be on a spectrum, with one end being the extremely simplistic waggle controls, where shaking the Wii remote is the equivalent of pressing a button, and the other end being the extremely precise use of the IR pointer. Mad World splits the difference between these extremes, with the most precise actions requiring moving the controller in a specific direction, whether it's to the right, left, up, down, together, rotationally, etc. It takes a similar route to No More Heroes, which passed on laser precision in an effort to keep the motion controls from intruding upon movement and progression. They're looser than the IR pointer, but not as frivolous as simply shaking the Wii remote, though there are QuickTime events throughout that still require frantic shaking of the controller. Even when the game gets a bit more creative with how the motion controls are used, like in the Bloodbath challenges, things still feel pretty natural. The motion controls are still some of the most responsive and contextually intuitive inputs I've ever seen on the Wii, and aside from some harebrained decisions like mapping your dodge to shaking the nunchuck, a terrible move when your gameplay is so dependent on dodging enemy attacks, Mad World's motion controls, in general, are pretty non-intrusive. But Mad World's greatest flaw is not the motion controls themselves. It's the way the gameplay needs to compensate for these controls.
Lord help me save my soul. I'm trying not to lose control. I'm trying not to lose control. But I might have to let you go.
Mad World takes place in a third-person perspective, but you might notice just how close the camera is to Jack's character model. It very much reminds me of third-person shooters like Gears of War or the combat portions of Uncharted. This design decision was intentional, and it's easy to see why. In an effort to accommodate the motions the player must make with the Wii remote, Jack is used as a sort of digital avatar. When the player slashes downward with the Wii remote, Jack does the same, so it's clear that this was meant to visually emulate the player's movements. The screen acts as a sort of pseudo-Kinect, mirroring the player's action using the provided camera real estate. It's a logical visual pattern. However, this also makes the camera very difficult to contend with in certain situations. When crowds of enemies are clustered around Jack, or even worse, when precision platforming comes into play, the camera is often concentrated too tightly. A common occurrence that really shows this problem is when enemies attack from behind. Sure, this has been an issue for third-person shooters as far back as Resident Evil 4, but Mad World is meant to focus on high-intensity action, and few things wreck combo momentum like getting a cheap shot from behind. So what do motion controls do to build up Mad World's design? How do they serve the gameplay? Well, in all honesty, they don't. The motion controls don't add anything to Mad World, they're a total novelty. Mad World's motion controls are supplementary at best. There are no real mechanical advantages to how the motion controls are implemented into the game's design. If this was on any other system, the design would be just the same. But here's the thing, Mad World didn't need motion controls to be a good game, but it needed them to be an interesting game. Beyond the core mechanics of combat that are inherent to Jack's character, there's no real depth to his moveset. All of the nuance, all of the shock and awe came from how Jack navigates and interacts with each level's items and killing tools. Hell, take away the motion controls and the slick Sin City art style, and you have a pretty standard action game, one that, while well designed and thorough in its stage construction, lacks a totally unique core mechanic. For Bayonetta, it was Witch Time. For Revengeance, it was the parry. Mad World succeeds because of the structure of its levels, the solid skeleton of its gameplay. But that isn't enough to make the game stand out from many other action games available at the time. It's a tough pill to swallow, for sure. But when it comes to mechanics, Mad World is simple. And simple isn't enough for an action game like this to succeed. There needs to be a layer of mechanical complexity. There needs to be meat on the bones. So this far in, it may sound like I think Mad World is a lackluster project from Platinum Games, a picture-perfect example of a first try. But all things considered, I think Mad World is a pretty great game that's worth playing. The presentation is totally unique and distinctive from that of its peers, the controls are surprisingly intuitive, and the combo potential via level design instead of techniques is a clever subversion of the core elements of character action games. Mad World is its own animal. It's difficult for me to find a game to compare it to, even in Platinum's library all the way to 2018. Since Mad World's debut in 2009, Platinum Games has grown into a name that holds meaning. A game with that iconic P-Star logo carries connotations of stylish presentation, intense action, and a realization of original visions. Mad World checks all of those boxes, but it also does what Platinum did before its members even stood under that name. It's a contortion of expectations, a spin on tried and true concepts that puts the player in an intoxicating dizziness. Every familiarity is framed with a twist. For every comforting appearance, there are several subversions of expectations. Mad World has flaws, but as Platinum Games' debut, it set a standard. And while it still stands in the shadow of its more successful brothers and sisters, it would be an absolute travesty to ignore its place in the history of its now iconic studio.